Hi, everybody, and welcome to our next Kavli Conversation on Science Communication. I'm really excited about this one for many reasons. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program here at NYU, where I'm a professor of journalism. And I also run the Science Communication Workshops, which are workshops to give scientists and young physicians, other bioresearchers, the basics of science communication. So we're trying to attack this problem of science communication from both ends. We're both training journalists and we are training scientists to be better communicators. Part of that certainly is developing a better social context for both the communication part of this and the science part of this, and which is why today's topic is so important. I'm very grateful to Angela Saini and Fausto-Sterling for agreeing to come to talk about this today. And I'm very grateful to Robin Morantz-Hennig, our special guest moderator, and to Lee Holtz, our longtime moderator, for helping to arrange this and agreeing to moderate in Robin's case. So I will leave it to Robin to do the formal introductions, but I will just say something about Robin. She is an absolutely highly accomplished science journalist and author, and also a terrific teacher that we're very proud to have associated with us at NYU. So Robin, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dan. Welcome, all of you, to the Kavli Conversations, a chance for us to get together in this public space and online to talk about journalists and scientists and how the issues that are raised by the complexities of certain scientific issues are communicated to the public. These conversations are co-sponsored by the Kavli Foundation and the SHERP program at NYU. In 3 weeks, on April 25th, you can come back here for the final one of the semester, a talk about the future of wild in a tame world with journalist Emma Maris and conservation biologist John Roman. Usually, as Dan said, these conversations are moderated by Lee Holtz, the distinguished writer-in-residence of SHERP, a title that pretty much embodies everything about Lee for those who know him. One of the things that makes him so distinguished is that he has a fine sense of propriety, and it was Lee's wisdom to see that when we're having a conversation about how women are treated and portrayed in science, it's probably a good idea to have a woman. So that's where I come in. As Dan said, I'm a member of the SHERP faculty, and I teach the summer class in journalism ethics. One of the best parts of that is that alums get in touch with me for consultation over ethical issues they face on the job. I actually love that part of my job. I love that the graduates of this program continue to challenge their own assumptions and try to do the right thing even when it's hard. So today we're going to talk about gender, but in a very specific way. We've been hearing a lot about what it's like to be a woman over the past year or so, but most of what we've been hearing is not what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're not going to talk about the Me Too movement, or gender discrimination in STEM careers, or sexual harassment in university labs, or the new reboot of Roseanne. We're going to talk about what science does and doesn't know about being female, about how that knowledge is colored by sexist assumptions even in the research design, and especially our main focus, how the bias in the research itself complicates things for those of us whose job it is to communicate what science does and doesn't know about being female. We'll be guided in this discussion by our two guests. We're really lucky to have both of them. Dr. Anne Fausto-Sterling, first, is a pioneer in the field of studying sex and gender. She's a professor emerita of biology and gender studies at Brown University, an eminent scholar and teacher, and also a science popularizer herself. She writes blog posts for the Boston Review, the Huffington Post, and Psychology Today. She's the author of 3 landmark books: Myths of Gender, Biological Theories About Women and Men, Sex/Gender, Biology in the Social World, and probably her most famous book, Sexing the Body, Gender Politics and the Construction of Sexuality, which will be reissued in a 20th anniversary edition in, I guess, 2020. For which Anne will be writing some new material. She's the winner of many awards, including the Outstanding Academic Book Award of the American Library Association for Sexing the Body, and she's been an elected fellow of AAAS since 1990. Angela Saini is a science journalist who has come to us all the way from London. She's not jet-lagged yet, I don't think. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, New Scientist, Wired, GQ, BBC Radio 4, and many others. Angela is the author of 2 books, Geek Nation, How Indian Science is Taking Over the World, and Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, and the New Research That's Rewriting the Story, which won the Book of the Year prize from Physics World and will be the book we're talking about tonight. She's won lots of other awards, including being named European Science Journalist of the Year in 2009 by the Euroscience Foundation. She's now working on a book about the science of race because she likes to take the easy topics. And we might circle back around and talk about that a little bit at the end. As Dan said, if you have questions, please interrupt us. Come up to the microphone and I'll see you eventually and I'll let you ask your question. We're also fielding questions from Twitter. So if you're watching online and have a question, send it to us with the hashtag Kavli Convo and we'll have it read here. So I want to start by thinking about our roles as science journalists when we're confronting a thorny issue like how women are treated in science. Angela, in your book, you're making the case that science is not an objective reflection of reality, but really a reflection of the prejudices and implicit bias of the researchers, the people doing the work. So do you feel like that makes it less important or maybe more important for you to come off as objective and to try to show both sides of the issue?
Well, first of all, I should say I don't think it's entirely constructed. I think it is constructed in some ways, but then I do think what science does as a process is try to get towards the truth. And I do think, for me, I'm a humanist, I'm a rationalist, and I do think that science is the best way we have of understanding the world, and that's why I am a science journalist. But you're right, it's complicated. How do you, confronted with a study that says that women have smaller brains so they have lower IQs, how do you present that to the world? Do you even present it to the world? And that's exactly what happened to me last year. So when, around the time my book came out, a study was published in the journal Intelligence, and saying exactly this, that women have smaller brains and they are less smart. And I got a call from a journalist at the Sunday Times, which is one of our national newspapers in the UK, asking me about it, what were my thoughts on it. And my thought was, Intelligence is not the best publication, and these researchers who have written this study are not the best researchers. And I would be extremely dubious about this because we have known for a long time that there is no average IQ difference between men and women. And our brains are smaller because, on average, we are smaller, so our brains are in proportion with our bodies, just like a smaller man has a smaller brain, you know. So I told him not to cover it, and he went ahead and covered it. And it got picked up by the right-wing press, and it got covered everywhere because it was that kind of study. It confirmed some people's gender stereotypes, and it was really dangerous.
So if that study had come out while you were writing your book, would you have just discounted it, or would you have somehow put it in and shown why it was wrong?
Well, I think what I was trying to do as a journalist when I was writing my book is show the ways in which not just science itself can be manipulated, and, you know, depending on the funding that the researchers are getting, the types of researchers who are doing stuff, not all journals are equal. You know, so there is a lot of stuff that gets published in fairly dodgy journals that looks completely bona fide. You'd think it's fine, but unless you know better, unless you've studied this area really deeply, and often journalists haven't, you know. And there are some journalists on beats who have only just started covering science, so of course they don't know the journals very well. And that this is kind of, these are institutions upon establishments, upon networks, and unless you know exactly how this network works, it's very easy to make mistakes. So the way I approached Inferior was to look at the very big high-profile studies, the ones that got heavily cited but also got a lot of coverage, and look behind them. What was the story behind this story that we all read about in the press, and which claimed to say that there were profound differences psychologically or intellectually between men and women? And often the story is far more complicated, and very often there is some bias at work there or some kind of agenda at work. And that should worry us because we like to think that science is free of bias and agenda, and the fact is it isn't.
So Anne, when you're trying to convey some of your findings and your scientific ideas to journalists, do you find that we are looking for ways to simplify things? Like when you're talking about gender not being a binary, we don't do so well with continuums and with complexities. Does it happen that journalists get it wrong, and what do you do about that?
Well, journalists get it wrong, yes. But when a journalist calls me and does the setup, and wants me to talk about is something nature or is it nurture, what I now do, and I have done for some time, is to refuse the premise. And some journalists do very well with that and are willing to hear me try to articulate a different premise, and others are like, how can you refuse that premise? But so that's the tactic I take when, as a scientist or someone, I'm often called on background for stories, that a journalist calls and says there's this new article or there's this new whatever, and what I do is to try to refuse that, to try to then train the journalist, as it were. It's almost like you have to. It's like an Escher print of some sort. You look at it one way and everything looks like they're flying fish, and then you stare at it long enough and suddenly they're flying birds. And what I try to do is get the journalists to stop seeing fish and to see birds. Yeah. I mean, that's my goal in a conversation.
That sounds like a nightmare interview because if I called you up because I or my editor wanted me to confront this complex question of whether gender is nature or nurture, and you're telling me I don't even believe in your premise, I think I might hang up, or I might be polite.
Well,
but you'd be undoing everything about the basic thing that the journalist is trying to get across. I mean, do you find that sometimes they just don't even use your reframing of the question? Or
sometimes, but I find that, I mean, there's certain people, of course, don't call me because they know I'm not going to, play in their ballpark. But for the ones who call me and who are willing to take some time working at it, they mostly I find that they're pretty game. They they'll say there's this other way of looking at it. Some people don't even look at it this way; they look at it this other way, and try to give it a shot. If it's a especially if it's a longer form piece, there's space to do that.
Right.
Sometimes I don't get quoted. But that's fine. I mean, I still feel like, and I said this to you over the phone. The teacher in me is like, well, maybe I've planted a seed. That will grow enough that at some point the journalists can't see the world the old way, which means they're going to have to start reconstructing how they report.
Right. I find, I'm ashamed to admit this, but when I write about something like gender issues, sometimes I wonder that I'm like unconsciously cherry-picking a little bit, or going towards the scientists whose worldview I like the best or understand the best. Has that been a problem for you, Angela, in writing this book or articles on this subject? And if it has, how do you deal with it?
Well, the trolls online would say that's what I do, that I cherry pick, because I don't happen to cherry pick the people that they agree with. But then I would say there aren't that many people who agree with them within the sciences, so it's not really my fault. But yeah, it's tough. Do you know, when I was writing my book, at the back of my head all the time was the Twitter trolls. I did think, what will they say about this? And I tried so hard to reference everything, to be so thorough that nobody would be able to come back at me and say I wasn't being fair. I gave everyone, even the people I profoundly disagreed with, every opportunity to make their point, gave them every chance to read whatever papers they had to read. I gave them all the time in the world to do it. And I was as fair as I thought I could be. And I think this is a topic that deserves that, and it needs that right now, because there's a lot of polemic, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. There's a lot of kind of one-sided stuff on both sides, actually. And as a woman and as a journalist, I knew I had to be more thorough and be as kind of, not balanced, because I think balance can sometimes set up false dichotomies, but, be as rigorous as possible. And if I was going to lay out an argument, then to do it in the most scientific way possible. Always I was thinking they're going to accuse me of being a postmodernist. They're going to accuse me of being a SJW. I didn't want that to happen, and it didn't happen. It's very difficult, I think. That's why it's, even the right-wing press have had to say it was fair, it was balanced at least.
And do you have to deal with those kind of questions? I mean, you straddle both sides. You're a popularizer as well as a scientist. Do you feel a need to try to be balanced somehow, or?
I don't feel a need to try to be balanced, because I certainly have a point of view, but I feel a need to really know that I can back up whatever I'm saying. And I use certain pretty right-wing and hostile sounding boards, actually. They're listservs. I'm on a listserv of scientists. The name of the listserv shall go unmentioned, but it's people who work on sex and gender, and it includes among them many, people who hate Foucault, hate postmodernism, hate feminists, think all feminists are muddy-headed, and like to throw around the social justice warrior.
I got
thing.
called a mud woman recently, and I wasn't sure if that was because of my colour.
You got called
a mud woman online on
really?
one of these right-wing blogs,
Yeah.
and I wasn't sure if that was because of my colour or because of the way I think.
So when I'm thinking through something, maybe, when I'm thinking through something, I usually provoke this listserv in some way. I put out an article or I say something, or I criticize one of the things they've posted, and then I just sit back and watch them explode. And through that explosion, I get a sense of what the response is, and then I try to see what I think of the response and write, not in response to it directly, but knowing that that's one kind of response I may get, so that I don't stay in my own world of just good friends who all agree with me.
Well, that
I think
sounds
that's
really
really important not to do.
So it's like putting it out on Twitter without having to worry about Twitter or doing it
Right,
all in public.
right.
It's
This
like
is a
behind the
closed.
scenes.
This is a closed listserv.
Yeah.
I know who a lot of the characters are, and I can pretty well
Yeah.
predict it. But they surprise me. There are a few friends online, and I get back channel things saying, "Oh, good for you." But I'm always doing it not for a purpose. I have an idea. I want to see how people are going to respond to it before I actually put
And
it
it
out there.
changes what you finally do put out there in public.
It does.
Sometimes.
Sometimes, not that I'll. At least I know what arguments I've got to shore up, and that's really it. So if someone says, "Oh, she's never read X, Y, and Z," or "so and so really nails it and shows what a stupid idea that is," I go and read, and I may write the person and say, "Give me the reference, send me the PDF." And I'll read it and see what I think of it, and I may reference it and refer to it then. So I try to back myself up that way by knowing what the other side is going to say, but I have this outlet. I mean, I have friends who say, "Why don't you get off that?" I've been on this listserv for years and years, and it serves a very specific purpose for me.
Yeah. Angela, you have a line in your book. You say that things we might find objectionable at a dinner party somehow sound palatable when a scientist says it. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. Scientists sometimes say unpalatable things too. But do you think that as a background, makes us need to be a little extra skeptical when we're using scientists as sources?
Yes, I think we venerate science. So I was on the March for Science last April, and again and again, everybody was chanting, science is great, this is the best way of understanding the world, why are you discounting this rational, wonderful thing that we're doing? Why are you not funding us when we know what you don't know? We are the experts. And while that's important when science is under attack, what it's also done is create in the public mind this impression that science is somehow infallible, that it is perfect and that every time a new paper comes out that this is the unvarnished truth. That is not how science works. It's a process. It often makes mistakes. Scientists are only human, so obviously they will also make mistakes. And their personal agendas do affect the work that they do, not just in the speculation, but also sometimes in the very results. Even having a certain point of view can skew how your results come out in certain human behavioral experiments. I mean, Anne works very much with children, and certainly when you're observing gender differences in children, I'm sure this comes up a lot. You can see what you want to see sometimes. So, yeah, we do need to be careful. We need to be critical as observers or consumers of science and think about the story behind what we're reading. What are they actually doing?
Would either of you want to make the case that in studies of gender or understanding women better, that it needs to be primarily women scientists who do those studies?
I don't know. I wouldn't make that case. I think it needs to be people who will think carefully about their own gender and their own gendered place in the world. But it doesn't, no.
Men can do that.
I mean,
Okay.
representation matters because the male domination of science is what led to the problems of misunderstanding of women. But that doesn't mean that women get it right all the time and men get it wrong. It just means that you need to have a different set of perspectives in order to understand the topic properly. And if you only have one set of perspectives, then obviously you're not going to understand
Yeah,
it.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's the case for diversity of personnel in science in general. And speaking of the March for Science, there were certain scientists who attacked the principles of the March for Science, one of which included diversity of scientific workforce, with this old idea, circling back to objectivity, that science is objective and so race, gender, national origin of the scientist should make no difference. But in fact, I agree with Angela that it absolutely does, and the way out of that is not to assume that everybody has just a personal-based view of the world, but that if you begin to have a diversity of people from different backgrounds and a diversity of ideas working together, that begins to produce a more valid, rounded view of the world.
Arguments have been made about diversifying the newsroom for the same reason.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
I'm curious about the reaction to your work, both of you. And when we spoke the other day, I told you that I expected that the response to your early work would have been much more critical 30 years ago because people weren't really thinking about that, gender being socially constructed or our ideas that gender can help shape the parameters of scientific research. But you said that hadn't really been your experience. In fact, it's been the other way around, that it's more critical now. So can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The first edition of Myths of Gender came out in 1985, and there was a tiny group of us, women scientists, who were beginning to counter just what those were myths about. These were the days, for those of you who weren't born then, when the Hubert Humphrey, when he was running for president of the United States, his doctor said, well, women couldn't be president because what if they were undergoing menopause during something like the Cuban Missile Crisis? They would have exploded the world. And nobody thought that was an odd thing to say.
And then we elected Trump.
And then we elected Trump, right? Yeah, we don't even want to go there. So, I mean, those were the myths that were the current ideas, and there were a small group of women scientists, myself, Ruth Hubbard, Ruth Blyer, who's deceased, Evelyn Fox Keller, a handful of us that were starting to counter those myths in books and public venues. So we were like a little group against a huge thing, and my book was favorably reviewed in the Times, and my colleagues, who were all biologists, looked at it and said, well, you know, of course, this is just bad science, and you know, nobody thinks that way anymore. I'm like, yeah, but by the time, you know, 15 years later, there's a feminist movement, a gay rights movement. There's dozens of women writing about gender and science, and there begins to be a pushback against, and a whole science studies movement. So writing about the ideas of objectivity. There's a feminist critique of objectivity. I mean, there's all of these things that are out there in the academy. There starts to be pushback from mainstream within the academy. And, you know, it's a pushback against us, against the idea of postmodernism, whatever these folks mean by it. A pushback against the scholars like Foucault. So there's been a huge sort of intellectual movement that then starts to get pushback. So there's much greater pushback now, I think. Even though the war for the kind of objectivity that Steven Pinker loves, and he's one of the ones who attacked the March on Science for being political when science isn't political. And so I think that war has been lost, but the pushback is still very strong.
So the more powerful and coherent the critical science movement is, the more there's a
That's what I
pushback
think.
against it. Which isn't enough to silence you, it's just enough to sort of get your juices going, I imagine. And to have a 20th anniversary edition come out.
That's nice.
Angela, when we were talking about response to your book, you said that you've traveled around talking about your book and you kept coming up against the notorious Google memo guy. The memo that said that the reason there aren't more women at Google is that women aren't constitutionally fit to be computer programmers. And you said that there's really a growth in that kind of belief. There's this groundswell.
It seems that way. I mean, I'm sure it's been there for a long time, but these people haven't felt as emboldened as they do now. They feel very able to complain about affirmative action and equal opportunities and the idea of equality, as though equality is a bad thing, forgetting that it's a political ideal, it's not a scientific or biological one. It's a good thing that we've decided that we're all equal. But I have a James Damore story to tell you because it just happened today.
So this is the writer of the memo.
I did a couple of op-eds when the memo came out because it was around the same time as my book came out. And then, James Damore has been on the speaking circuit, he's been doing talks at universities and stuff. And so last month, I think, or maybe last month, on Twitter, I asked him to read my book. And he said yes. So we sent him a copy. And today he got back to me and said he read it. And he sent me a really long email saying that he liked it and he learned some lessons. And actually what astounded me, because a lot of people in this area, the alt-right and the men's rights activists, just don't want to engage. All they want to do is attack. They don't read your work. They just attack, and they send you bell curves, pictures of studies and things, and say, well, what about this? And he read the book, and he engaged with it, and he sent me stuff that he disagreed with, and he also said, I generally agree with everything you've written.
So
and we have we had a really nice discussion on Twitter. And, I mean, I don't know his circumstances. I'd love to have a proper conversation. We have said we'll meet up, although he lives in California, I live in London, but we will meet up at some point, I hope, and have a discussion, because I think we need a dialectic. We need to come to some agreement here and not just have two sides shouting at each other. Those who are opposed, who have different views from me, I want to engage with them, unless they're just hate-filled, which some of them are, but if they're not, and they're willing to engage and they want to learn, I am also willing to hear them out. So I'm hoping it's progress. That's what I think anyway, it's progress.
That's great. That's great. I mean, I'd love a story where Twitter actually ends up civilizing the discourse. So gender is such a politically sensitive topic. The language of gender, in my professional lifetime, the terminology that's acceptable to use or unacceptable to use seems to have changed so much. So I feel like that's something that could bedevil both the scientists doing the work and the journalists writing about the work. And back in 1993, you wrote an article for the Sciences on the five sexes, and you used words like hermaphrodite, which I don't think anybody would use now, and words like firms and merms, which I know later you said you were doing to be provocative.
Right.
You made them up. But talk a little bit, if you would, about what's changed in the past 25 years and whether there's anything maybe you would do differently now if you got a do-over.
Well, I mean, 25 years ago, the New York Times would not use the abbreviation MS. I mean, so it was Mrs. or Mr. Those were your choices. Or maybe it was 30 years ago. I don't know when they finally gave in on that. But so the whole push to change language from within the feminist movement, started in the 70s. So that's longer ago. I lose track of time. But and it's continuous. So the language is continuously changing. So I wouldn't use the same language that I used in 1993. But on the other hand, what I was doing in that piece was taking the medical language and trying to make fun of it in a way that would provoke it to re-examine its own assumptions. So I don't have a problem with doing that then. I wouldn't do it now.
Mm-hmm.
There's other things.
Other ways to do it, right.
So the language right now is changing so fast that it's very hard to figure out, as you're writing, the minute you've written it, that becomes static, and yet there's whole new, activist spin-off groups that are still playing with the language and won't like the language that you've used, or so it's I think for journalists especially, it's a really tough challenge, and I suppose depending on what outlet you're writing for, you've got whatever their linguistic standards are that you have to abide by, but the language is being played within activist movements in a way that we have no control over that. We have to listen to it. We have to see where it goes. We have to respond to it. And some of the ideas that are sort of out there now being played with will, take in our general language, and others won't.
Mm-hmm.
That what pronouns you use. In some countries, I guess Sweden has made a gender-neutral pronoun now that has apparently become part of the language, just in the way that we now say letter carrier and we don't say mailman, or we say flight attendant and we don't say stewardess. I mean, when those ideas were first proposed, people were like, how crazy is that? But now they're an automatic part of our language. So some of the language that's getting played with now, I think, will become part of our general usage, and others people will forget about it. It'll be something of the moment.
Mm-hmm. Do you struggle, Angela, with coming up with the right terminology, using the right language, looking back to 10 years ago or so and saying, oh my God, I shouldn't have
really
said it that
tough.
way?
I'm a millennial, but just under the wire of a millennial. My sister is 10 years younger than me, and she's a feminist scholar, political scholar, and I don't understand what she's saying sometimes, because the language moves so fast, you can feel yourself outdated all the time, and it's really difficult to keep up. I try to keep up, but then again, when I'm writing, I have to write for everyone. I can't just write for the young women who understand all the terminology. I have to write for the 70-year-old man who doesn't. So I have to keep it as basic as possible in terminology that everybody understands. So in general, I don't use the latest things. I use the stuff that's already well known, that everybody can
Sort
get
of the
it.
penultimate, not the...
Yeah.
Sometimes making it a language choice is almost aligning yourself one way or another. Like
That's right.
I think there's a debate in the intersex community whether to say disorders of sexual development or intersex.
That's right.
And when if you sort of think DSD sounds more neutral, and it turns out the people that are reading it think it sounds too medicalized, you're stuck. You're in the middle somehow.
You have to take that cue from the people themselves. So when I was writing about intersex, I spoke to lots of intersex people. I asked the Intersex Association in the UK, how do I do this? and I got them to read through it and, you know, really guide me on that. And I think that's, you know, you can't just imagine up for yourself how things should be. You have to kind of take the guidance from the people themselves.
So what are we supposed to do next? I mean, how do we make sure that we're not actually distorting the science in our effort to be fair, or, you know, like, are we in danger of almost using our own political sensitivities to not accurately report what scientists know about sex and gender?
I don't see how you don't use your own political sensitivities. I mean, they're you know, they're the air you breathe. You can be aware of them so that you make an attempt to say maybe somebody from another point of view might view this differently. But this gets back to your opening question of objectivity. And, you know, everybody has a point of view. There is no neutral space without a point of view. So when you write, you're writing from a point of view, and the question is, how explicit do you make the point of view, and how many other points of view? And that's a choice. In I mean, I'm not trained as a journalist, but I am trained as a scientist. So you're supposed to try to look at a literature critically and not leave out half the literature because you don't like how it fell out. But you can certainly include literature and say, but here are the things a paper doesn't address that you think need to be addressed in order to fully validate a certain point. I mean, I think that that there's a way to do balance, but still acknowledge a point of view.
Yeah, I think I agree with Anne that it's, I think as a journalist, I've chosen to wear my politics on my sleeve. I'm a feminist and I'm on the left. Now, when you're working within an organization, for example, I used to work at the BBC, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to wear your politics on your sleeve. You have to very firmly park it at home and not let anybody know. But I think it's important for people to know where you come from, because that is the lens through which you're seeing the world. And if you're also aware of your own biases, then you can go to steps to challenge them. So it works both ways. It works both as a model for you to challenge yourself, but also to let people know that you do have a point of view.
And so BBC won't let you assert your biases because they're
not in public.
They're public.
Yeah, not in public. Obviously, you can vote and you can do everything you want to do, but just your public persona is a neutral one.
So now we run up against a lot of the same issues when writing about gender as you're encountering now writing about race, and so I'm interested in hearing the two of you make some connections between the two. I mean, in a way, it's talking again about our tendency to look at binaries when what's really happening is something that exists on a spectrum, the tendency to look for genetic or anatomical differences to define categories that aren't really biological categories but are socially created. So Angela, you said that when you first wanted to write this book, you couldn't actually find a publisher interested in it. So that the tenor of the time seems to have changed.
Well,
Did I get that wrong?
No, I didn't pitch it to anybody, so I didn't even write it down as an idea or send it to anyone. But I just assumed that nobody would be interested.
So what do you think is different
How would
now?
you describe the book, I mean, that you're talking about?
It's a book on the science of race, similar to Inferior, but what I'm looking at is context, politics, history, culture, all the things that go into race. And I think what has troubled me about a lot of the writing on race is, you know, either it's looking at the context or it's looking at the science. And these things go together very often. And there is some very good scholarship on this, a lot of it actually. So I want to bring that together and write it. I mean, I have a very direct experience of this. Obviously, I grew up as an ethnic minority in London at a time when London was a very racist city. I hope that my son, who is now 4, would never have to see the kind of racism that I did. But now we have Brexit. Trump is in power here, the far right is on the rise, and I know that's not going to happen. That he is going to see things that I really hoped he would never have to see. And we need this because there are many people out there who are using these biological arguments the same way that they did in the 1920s and the 1930s to claim that race is somehow real, that there are differences between the races that are so profound that equality is impossible, that we need to be treated differently. And we really need something now. We need it. So really this is a personal book that I'm writing from my own personal experience.
So do you think that those kind of scientific arguments about racial differences are qualitatively different from the scientific arguments that we're also subjected to about gender differences?
I think there's overlap because a lot of these scientific racists also happen to be scientific sexists. That shouldn't surprise us.
Convenient.
I mean, Anne will know, there's a lot of overlap between these people, which isn't surprising. They tend to be privileged white men who want the status quo, who don't want things to change, and their problem is with everybody who wants it to change. So, yeah, there is some academic overlap there, and some of the same issues. The big difference is the science of sex difference is very popular and it's very mainstream. The science of race is very different. Some of it is mainstream in a sense, it's not called race, it's called human variation or population genetics or other things. So in that sense, that is mainstream. But then race science, and by that I mean 19th century old school race science, the kind of race science that thought that there were superior and inferior races, that is in the shadows. So as an investigative reporter, and that's my background, that is the other territory that I'm exploring at the moment, this kind of murky, shadowy world of dubious journals, dubious researchers, very weird funding patterns, and it's a very dark territory to be exploring. But it needs to be out there. People need to understand where these ideas are coming from and the kind of gross political ways in which they're being used.
We encountered just a few weeks ago a little mini controversy about this that Anne got a little bit involved in. There was an op-ed in the New York Times by David Reich, who's a biologist at Harvard, where he was saying that that biologists do a disservice if they don't acknowledge that some of their genetic research is finding genetic differences among the races. I mean, that's basically a shorthand for what he did. And it was very controversial. Anne co-signed a letter written by dozens of eminent scientists objecting. Can you want to tell us about that a little bit, Anne, about that controversy?
The people who wrote the letter are a mix of scholars who work, and you probably will be familiar with a lot of their published work, but they are biologists, sociologists, ethicists, physical or biological anthropologists, a whole lot of people whose expertise is the study of race, and in this letter, which was published in BuzzFeed, and as of this morning had 75,000 reads, which is really nice, that basically that Reich may know how to do genetics, but he doesn't understand race, and that there is a whole scholarship on race that he would do well to connect with, and that he would do well to have interdisciplinary conversations with people who are experts in this area, who have plenty of biological training. But so basically the argument was that not that there are no genetic differences between individuals, but that genetic differences don't define race. And if you use racial categories, then the genetic differences that he's talking about don't fit. So that basically it's that he has the idea of race wrong. Not that he's wrong about, every individual in this room is genetically different from every other one. So, and there are other issues that the letter raised. It's a fairly long letter. By the way, the Times wouldn't print it or they wouldn't even print a shorter version of it, because originally there was it was produced as an op-ed in conversation with the Times editor into response to Reich, and then they just said, nah, forget it.
There was a very short letter, I think, today.
Yes, that's all I would do, and that was,
Yeah.
you know, as you say, that was a letter to the editor, but
Right.
there was an attempt to get them to do an equally lengthed op-ed,
Mm-hmm.
and at first they entertained the idea, and then they
Hmm.
said no. So luckily BuzzFeed, I mean, this is the blessing, and it's also a curse, but of online sources is that you can get a set of ideas out there, and sometimes in somewhat lengthier form than an op-ed even allows. And people can find it and read it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I want to get us back to gender. I thought we would talk about race a little bit because that is your current interest or your next interest. But were there things that you encountered, Angela, in researching your book that you felt like were huge surprise to you, or was it sort of confirmation of what you expected to find when you went into this?
When I was growing up, I wanted to study engineering at university, and because of that choice, even though I went to a mixed gender state school, I ended up being the only girl in my maths class, the only girl in my chemistry class, and when I got to university I was the only girl in my engineering class. And for a long time, I think, without ever vocalizing it to myself, I did internalize the idea that I was somehow different, that other women were other women and I was just an exception. And you know, that maybe boys were better at maths, maybe boys were better at these subjects, they had more interest in engineering or something, because that was what my experience taught me. And it was astounding for me to learn that actually the psychological differences across the board are either non-existent or minimal. On things like spatial awareness, I remember I had a boyfriend at university who would set me spatial awareness puzzles and said, I can do this better than you can because I'm a man. And I really believed him, even though I could do them just as well as he could. I really did believe him because it's such a prevalent idea out there that men are better at spatial awareness, they have better spatial awareness than women, they have better mathematical reasoning or whatever, all these things. Women are better at languages, they're more empathic. No, actually, the psychological studies don't show any of that. They don't back that up. And I think for me, realizing that, even though I think, you know, if I were to externalize it, I would have said, yeah, of course there are no differences, but I think internally I felt different because of the way, because, like I said, because of my life experience. Learning actually that there are very little differences there, psychologically or cognitively, puts into perspective the gross inequality we see in the world. I mean, just think how much inequality there is, how massive the gender pay gap is, how underrepresented women are in so many industries, given that we're not that different intellectually, hardly different at all. That's, you know, it just makes me feel the injustice far more keenly.
Interesting.
It just makes me angrier. So however much of a feminist I was before, and I was, it's made me, it's renewed that feminism.
We have a question.
Yes, hello. So sort of based off of this anger that you're expressing and talking about, you've both discussed how you've acknowledged or to some extent engaged with trolls or people who disagree with ideas that you're putting forth or exploring or highlighting. How do you keep from being consumed by what the trolls may think? Or, you know, just thinking about what their arguments and critiques might be. How do you do it?
well, I'm not consumed by trolls. I mean, if I get, you know, stupid comments on Twitter or on my Facebook page, mostly they come on Twitter if they come anyway, I assess them as to whether they're coming from some valid place or not, and if they're not, I'd block them. I don't respond to them. I don't have, I mean, at my age, I don't have time. Honestly, I've got a lot still left to do in the world, and I'm getting on in years, and I focused on getting done what I have to offer to the world. So occasionally I will get some comments on Twitter from someone who I think maybe is actually honestly asking me a question, and I'll respond in some way, and sometimes you can go offline to talk to them a little bit. If, again, like with Damore, if I feel that someone wants a back and forth. But otherwise, I'm like, I just block them, because I don't have time for it.
Yeah, I'm the same. I block a lot. Yeah, I don't have time for it.
You don't
either.
feed the trolls. I mean,
No.
even when you're trying to sell a book and want to sort of generate.
No. I don't need to sell a book that much. I'd rather it didn't sell. Don't buy it. No, I don't get it.
Yes.
Hello. Hi, I'm Jessica Segal. I'm on the faculty here. I also do a lot of science writing. And I have been a fan of Dr. Fausto-Sterling for many decades. 30 years ago, when your original or early work came out, the idea that sexual differences are created by social influence was really in the ascendance in our culture. And we've seen sociobiology, renamed as evolutionary biology or whatever they want to call it now, has really become the coin of the realm in the popular voice. So I wanted to hear your analysis of what you think are the most pernicious implicit biases that may be coming out of that we as journalists now really need to be on guard of, and especially Angela, about how this is in medicine, which affects us all very personally.
You want to start?
I do think things are changing. So there's an acknowledgement now within medicine, for instance, that women need to be included in clinical trials, which they are now, which is great. And that was through activism as well as from science. So I do think things are improving. I don't know.
Well, again, evolutionary psychology, which I think is what you're referring to, again, I don't think it has gained much in quality over the years. I think the animal sociobiology has produced an interesting literature in the study of animal behavior. This is very strange talking to someone who asked me a question over my back.
She's here. She's listening.
She's here. Okay. Yes.
I was staying away from the...
I know, I was ordered not to turn around, but it's very weird. Hi. But I don't know what I mean, for me, the big thing is to get back to the is it nature or nurture? For me, the new literature and everything that I think about is all about how body environments change bodies. So that dichotomy, and this is true in gender and medicine too, that dichotomy that has been set up for years about something either comes from the genes or it comes from the environment. It's a false dichotomy. And for me, that's the biggest thing to be aware of, because if you're talking about an adult with a medical condition, their body has an entire history to it. It's an entire developmental history, and there may be, their genes are reacting to their environment, but their environment is a particular environment, and you can't understand the one without understanding the other. And so you have to understand biology, as changing phenomena that are shaped by the world in which they exist. And for me, if every journalist writing about biology could keep that in mind, or at least writing about human biology. I mean, studies on animals, I think the same principle adheres, but you can do all sorts of controls when you're doing animal behavior studies that you can't do with humans. But if every journalist writing about bodies could keep that in mind, we get a different set of questions being asked by journalists, I think.
But your question was also, I think, that the culture has changed a little bit, right? And so the general presumption about what makes us who we are seems to have shifted from 30 years ago.
Yes. Historical explanations are definitely downplayed, and I'm talking about popular culture. This paleo
Genetics
stuff has become such coin of the realm, and it's based on faulty ideas about evolution and what the past was like.
Yeah, so we're kind of up against, when we're writing our articles, we have to we're going against the tide, kind of. It's not just a matter of understanding nature.
That is true, and it's certainly true
nurture.
that students entering the university walk in with that kind of set of ideas about women having evolved to the mythology is to be coy and choosy, and men can sow their sperm anywhere, and so they can. So, I mean, when you're teaching at the university, that's a set of assumptions you see in freshmen, and you try to, when you're teaching evolutionary biology, you try to teach them some decent evolutionary biology. But I can see how this would be a challenge writing as a journalist, maybe especially if you're writing in short form and you can't spell out all those assumptions.
It's a different way of thinking. Like you said before, it's about changing the way you look at the same topic. And I'd recommend reading Anne's work, obviously, but also the work of Sarah BlufferHurdy, who is an evolutionary biologist and really does look at things in the round. She looks at these same questions, but comes to very different conclusions because she looks at the context of history and society in coming to her conclusions.
It's sad to have to quote a book from the early 1980s that still has.
Yeah, but she's still alive, so you can interview her too.
Yeah, and she's not.
Hard to get.
She's not the only. There's a lot of feminist evolutionary psychologists who are actively writing and working and doing research, and not just the primatologists, but people working in a whole slew of areas. So there's a cohort of them which maybe you could cultivate as people to call on background to respond to things. I mean,
This suggests, though, that we're writing these things to make us a particular point, right? I mean, we're working very hard to find the scientists.
What you want to do is find people who can offer you on whatever the mainstream point of view is. As journalists, you're going to be trying to find people who offer you a critical point of view on that. But you'll make your own judgments about what you think. But
another question, Dan.
Hi.
So as science journalists, we're constantly drawing from literature that is based on these classifications that we now know are dubious. They're self-identified, so maybe that's some protection. But we're constantly writing about race or binary gender because that's what the literature is. And so I guess my question is, to what extent do you think, both of you think, really all three of you, Robin, you too, as a working journalist, to what extent should we just reject or ignore this sort of vast body of data that is based on this sort of narrow binary, or in the case of race, 3 or 4 choices or whatever it is? Or should we just acknowledge the limitations and write about it, but perhaps acknowledge that these classifications don't tell the whole story?
Well, good catch. I mean, it would be interesting to kind of have a boilerplate paragraph that you put into any article about, sex differences or something, saying, we recognize that there might not be only 2 genders, or the gender is a continuum. I mean, there might be something like that. I know that when the New York Times used to write about climate change, until recently, they don't do this anymore, there would be a standard paragraph. There's no debate anymore about whether climate change is real and whether it's caused by humans. Maybe that's one way to deal with this, because that's still the way research is done, right? Looking for males on the one hand and females on the other hand.
Yeah, except, one of the interesting things is that there are now new researchers who are trying to expand that research paradigm. Right. Just beginning to be things published where the notion of orientation or the notion of self-identified gender is being queried on a multi-level way as part of the setting up of the study population. So that's just starting to happen. So, I mean, you can only write about what exists, and so then you have to write about its limitations, but it's also possible to speculate and say, what will literature look like in 20 years when people's gender are assessed on a multiple set of scales? And there are just brand new methodologies starting to appear that try to do that in the psych research literature.
And in a sense, the old categories are still have meaning to them. I mean, why do we have a women's march? You know, it's because women historically have been oppressed. Now, of course, there is a spectrum there, but this was oppression of a group as defined. And so that's why we have a women's march. And even within biology, that dividing into groups has meant that looking at these two different groups and what people have thought of as nature, sometimes what they're looking at is nurture because they are looking at it in groups. And we still haven't picked apart how the grouping itself has created the data that we see. So in fact, taking apart those groups is a process that still needs to happen. And until we've done that, we can't start looking at people as individuals.
Can you explain that a little bit? That if you're looking at groups that we're calling male and female, which is still the preponderance of the human race, right? Is that they're generally one or the other?
We treat them as one or the other, and that's the important thing here. It's not about them biologically being different, although of course there are some, some hard differences, but generally we treat them as different, and that treatment matters. It matters to the biology, and it matters to us in understanding gender. So as long as those categories are real in the world, then they are actually important still in science, because that's often how the differences arise in the first place.
Okay, so they're worth studying in that way.
Yeah, the fact that I'm treated as a woman will affect my biology. So, it's still a valuable category. It's still a valuable variable.
Does either of you ever find yourselves sort of going back to the early research and trying to assess that or put it in context?
Can you say what you mean by the early research?
Well, like research that was done before, I don't know, before we understood that gender was more socially constructed and maybe didn't include women at all, or was the kind of research that would find that their brains are smaller and so therefore they must not be as intelligent? I mean, was there old sort of outdated thinking that drove the older research from the 50s, 60s that needs to be reassessed now, or should it just be ignored altogether?
Well, some of that is happening. So people are going back. For example, Bateman's famous paradigm, and this said that it was used to say that men and women are sexually very different, that men are naturally promiscuous, women are naturally monogamous, based on a fruit fly experiment that Angus Bateman did, and that's been replicated and shown to have been false by Patricia Gowerty. So some people are revisiting that. There's some stuff we don't need to revisit, like in the 1910s or whatever, when they said that women's brains are smaller and that makes them less intelligent.
Just forget that stuff.
Yeah. Well, we know that women's brains on average are smaller because we are smaller on average. And we know that average intelligence is the same. What more do we need to know beyond that? We know everything we need to know, I think. But we have to remember that these mistakes are still being made. When we say old, as though they were only made in the past and they're not being made now, they're being made now. And this is the moment we need to tackle the big problems.
Or sometimes, I mean, recently and in a psych publication revisited the question of, do boys at birth weigh more than girls, and correlated with that, do they have bigger brains? And I looked at some old data sets like national registries, so huge numbers, I mean, hundreds of thousands of individuals' data, and in those older data sets, all in well-heeled European or Western European or American or North American countries. In fact, on average, if you get it way up there, the numbers way up there, boys average about a ½ pound more at birth weight, than girls, full term. Now, the question is why? So in the old data, that was just sort of seen as like a natural thing, you know, kind of like a flesh-colored Band-Aid is supposed to be the color of my flesh, and everybody just assumed that's what color is, flesh color, my color. But now the interesting question would be to ask, what is different about gestation of a XY fetus and an XX fetus that might produce a small weight difference, and what are there important corollaries that go with this and other aspects of development, rather than just saying, well, of course boys are born bigger. So in that sense, I went back and looked at those data sets, and they show up in national registry after national registry when there's complete nutrition. So they aren't true in countries where mothers tend to be undernourished. And if anything, girls are born a little bigger then. So it's also contextual. You have to have eaten enough in order for that difference to show up. So sometimes there are old things in the data that might raise interesting questions in a new context.
Yeah. So you're saying that now we might reflect and wonder why an observation exists, and in the old days they just presented the observation and it didn't really reflect.
And it meant boys had bigger brains, and so of course that was just of a piece with the, you know, they're born bigger, they're born stronger, they're born smarter, you know.
I think we have another question over there, right?
Yeah. Hello. So a lot of this conversation has been about changing vocab and giving context, and how even for someone who's writing about this regularly, it can still be something that's hard to keep up with or always know where a term comes from. So as the two of you, as people who write about this often, I'm curious about where you decide to draw the line for giving context when talking about this. When you have decided that the term doesn't need elaboration anymore, or if the story's not about the debate on a term, how much of that you decide to include, and when you decide you don't need to talk about the debate anymore. I'm just kind of curious for how the two of you gauge that.
I think maybe the two reporters should answer that.
Well, it's a very interesting question, this whole idea of what's taken for granted versus what seems to require definition and explanation and context. I mean, the last time I wrote about gender, it was specifically about what makes people transgender, so I felt like I needed to explain everything because it was all new to me as part of it, but it was also kind of new to my readers. So I didn't take anything for granted. Angela, you might be at that state too, right?
Yeah, the same.
So,
I think you can take it.
And writing for a book or writing for a scientific journal, you get feedback from reviewers. And I think that's a very good gauge. If there's a whole bunch of stuff that I wrote that seemed pretty obvious to me and maybe to my friends who read it, but the reviewers are like, she wasn't clear about this and she wasn't clear about that, and this, what about this other thing? And you look at it and you think, oh, I've really got to explain a lot more of my background assumptions, because if a reviewer in psychology who just isn't in my field isn't following me, then I need to put in more.
And as a science writer, I have to say, it's very tempting to use the technical information and technical jargon and then explain it. I tend to just leave it out altogether, because often there are ways of explaining things that don't require any technical terms at all.
I think that's right.
I play with that question because I also want, at some level, to inform my readers. And so if there is a technical term that they're going to come up against or that doctors use that they need to understand, I want to at least give them that ammunition. So it's a balance. You also don't want to stop up the writing either. Yes.
Hi. I feel short, but maybe it'll work.
Pull it down a little.
First of all, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. And I wanted to swing back a second to the intersection of science and journalism.
My name's Katrina Carcasis. I'm doing whatever I can to follow in Anne's blazing path, deeply influenced by Anne. And I was very curious, Angela, to hear you talk about James Damore, and not to beat, a dead horse, but I'm curious about, having spoken to quite a few journalists, is how it is that journalists come to decide a particular individual is an expert or has expertise in a topic. And I find it alarming that James Damore is viewed as a credible voice on anything regarding science, and that he might, in the interest of balance, be put up against someone with deep expertise in the way that Anne has. And even in the New York Times, PhDs are not doctors, but people with a master's in science are referred to as doctor, and so those honorifics recapitulate. So it worries me a great deal, and I'm just wondering, I think each of you would have a different perspective about the concern around that, why you think this is happening. Maybe it's not new and I'm just becoming aware, but I find it troublesome.
Yeah, I think you're right. Obviously, Damore is not an expert on sex difference or gender, but he's in the public eye, having made this point very publicly and then having lost his job over it. And now he's a poster boy for a certain movement that really believes strongly in him. So to ignore him doesn't make any sense, given that so many people want to hear what he has to say and believe in him. So as a journalist, we can't ignore him, obviously. Right. But to treat him as an expert, obviously, wouldn't be right either. So from my point, when like, for example, today I was discussing things with him, I wasn't discussing points of evidence, because I honestly think there's no point, I don't see the value in that at all. He's got his little bits of data, I've got my book. Where are we going to get on that? Well, what I want to understand is his motivation. People are not born hateful. That had to have come from somewhere. At some point, he built up his ideas about the world, just like I built up my ideas about the world. And I want to understand where they come from. I want to know why he thinks the things they do. I want to understand why those on the alt-right think the things they do, why they believe them so strongly, and why they're willing to go up against equality, the fight for equality in that process. And we need to do that. We can't shy away from that as journalists. Hate is not something that just appears out of nowhere. What are they thinking? That's what fascinates me about him.
Well, the question also, though, is when we're looking for the other side, why is it that we go to somebody like that? And I think it's partly because it's the quick and easy way. I mean, he's been identified by his ideas, and so if we need somebody to say something alt-righty, we know who we can go to. And this is all part of how quickly things have to turn around, and how we need to just sort of quote from somebody who's a live, warm body who will say something.
It's very difficult to find those people in the scientific community.
It is.
There are a number of debates I haven't had because the producer or the editor cannot find someone for me to debate within science. Mm-hmm. So, then you have to turn to people like that.
But that does create a mouthpiece for him. It gives him a forum.
I would argue we can ignore him. So I have coffee. It elevates anecdata, and I find that problematic. But anyway, thank you for the response.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, Megan.
So this has been a wonderful conversation, but it's also been very limited to stories that touch on gender and race. And I was curious if any of you have thoughts on sort of how to apply some of these discussions and some of these questions and how we approach things to stories that have nothing to do, at least superficially or on an obvious level, to those topics.
So you're saying the stories do have something to do with gender, but we might not define it that way?
Pretty much, yeah. Or just how to bring a more conscious mindset to some of those issues that might not be super clear, but are underlying some of those topics.
Any
Well,
thoughts?
when you said don't have to do with gender and race, I mean, the one of the bigger questions that I think we've discussed today is the notion of objectivity, and the obvious one thing that's just so much in the news right now, where the question of how you apply objectivity is climate change and the anthropogenic nature of climate change, where the idea of that we're supposed to have a balance between people who think it's part of some random cycle and people who think it's caused by CO2 in our atmosphere are supposed to receive equal time. The question is how do you teach or how do you write about a science that's probabilistic? How do you write about what can count as being objective if you're doing computer modeling? I mean, I think the question of objectivity, point of view of the scientist, point of view of the writer, generalizes to any politically critical aspect of science that you'd be writing about, even if gender or race is not in the center of the topic. So it's interesting that the Times. Is it good that they don't use that boilerplate anymore? Or
Well, I think they actually got past the boilerplate and don't even bother with it
because
anymore. They don't try to
think
balance.
it's confirmed science.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that was actually a transitional period. It was them explaining, we're not going to go look for the climate change deniers every time we write about this.
Right, I see.
And then they kind of, I haven't seen that boilerplate in a while. Maybe I just read right past it. Angela, do you grapple with that, or trying to include the fact that we are all biased in one way or another in some of the other topics you write about?
Well, I do think that the way people think about science often, and I've thought this way myself for a long time, that science is somehow perfect, actually does a lot of damage. Because then, when, for example, on climate change, you see opposing views within science, you think, well, science isn't perfect, so maybe it's all wrong and climate change isn't happening, which is what a lot of people do. Actually, this kind of multiplicity of views within science has always been there. It has to be there because that's the way the process happens. So if we had a much more honest and less kind of lacquered view of science, kind of see it for what it is, which is this human endeavour to understand how things work, and it's a really good way of understanding how things work, but it does make mistakes. But if enough scientists tell you that this is a problem, then you should probably listen to them. The same way you listen to your doctor. Your doctor doesn't know everything about the human body, but at some point you've got to take their advice, just in order to move forward with your life and do something, get better. Kind of, if we had a less kind of detached relationship with science and a more honest, warm, kind of empathic one, seeing it as a human thing rather than a somehow ivory tower thing, then I think that would be healthier.
Which would be done by setting a context when you write about a scientific issue or discovery. I
think it's an educational thing as well. It has to, in the way we train people in science, and we train them in facts, which is, an important way to learn about the world. But if we understood how science is made and how it's done as well, I think it should be a crucial part of science education. Then I think we'd have a better
without falling into the hero narrative of not the Galileo narrative, but as you say, a much better idea of a notion of what the process of knowledge production is, and how something that is uncertain for any number of years or decades becomes more certain within a certain context at some point, so that's a gradual process by which something that wasn't a fact becomes a fact.
Yeah. And it's a real issue in philosophy, and I'm sure in the social science. Was it Bruno Latour recently who worried that postmodernism had wrecked public understanding of science by undermining what science is?
Yeah, Latour is very worried about that, and he was was at the forefront of doing that too.
That's why he's so aware of it.
Well, it is why he's so aware of it. I mean, and he's one of my absolutely favorite writers, both in the doing and now in the worrying about it, because I think one has to worry in this moment of sort of rejection of the whole idea of truth and the notion of, you know, alternative facts and all that. I mean, the fallback position is to go back to the March for Science, where science is truth, but that's not really a secure fallback place.
No, it's not. Yeah, it has its own problems.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a middle ground here, you know, that we need to just have an honest relationship with it. It doesn't have to be a postmodernist one. It doesn't have to be a March for Science one, but just have an honest relationship with science.
Yes.
Hi, thanks. I'm Andrea Jones-Roy. I'm a political scientist and a writer for 538. And I have a question about audience for all of you, which is, I think the easy answer is we're writing for everyone. But I feel like, I mean, when I find that I write about issues relating to gender, I'm writing for people who are already interested or engaged in that debate, and probably not the alt-right or, you know, the others who are not already in it. And so I never know how much time to spend trying to engage people who are not on the ship, or give people information and ammunition who are on the ship. Ammunition is too strong a word, but I mean, how do you see your role in terms of who you're communicating to? And I don't mean just like Twitter trolls, but like the actual article itself. Like, who do you think is reading it, and how do you aim it?
Well, for me, it depends on the publication. So every publication will obviously have its own audience that it knows about. I used to work in TV news for a while, and at ITV News, which is, I don't think there's any equivalent here, but you know, we were always told our audience is middle-aged women who are not working, and that's who we made all our programs and our news bulletins for. So it's very explicit in our minds. It's different when you're writing a book, because really you're deciding on your audience and then writing for them. And for me, Inferior, I was definitely aiming at women, even though I had the trolls in my head and I didn't know that other people would read it. It was really aimed at women who want to know themselves and understand themselves like I did. And I found it very empowering. You know, it really changed my life writing this book. All I want is for other women to have their lives changed as well. I was probably hoping too much.
Again, it does depend on the venue a lot. But if you're writing something of book length, you can make some choices. But even then you have to have that discussion with your publisher, because or at least their sales department is going to have an idea of how they want your book to sell. So in a book, I just figure I'm headed for a college-educated audience, and that's, you know, and then people are going to pick it up or not and read it.
I don't know if there has to be a hugely different way that you would write about something for the already initiated and sort of on board with you, and for the just generally curious. You know, I mean, there maybe even shouldn't be a big difference. I mean, maybe you wouldn't define quite as many words if you know that you're speaking to people who are very knowledgeable, but ideally, you want to sort of have a big tent, and anybody might want to come in and understand more.
And that gets me back to the point you made about not using jargon. It's the more familiar you become with an area, actually, the easier it is to think of simpler ways of saying something. And that just opens the door to more people to read it. So I think it's a really good. I don't always succeed in doing it, but I think letting go of jargon to the extent possible is a really good tactic.
Angela, do you have anything comparable to Anne's listserv of like throwing something up to people who might be really critical and, you know, have a lot of objections? And
in advance?
Yeah.
I haven't really done, well, I've occasionally written op-eds in the process of writing. So before Inferior came out, I wrote an op-ed and you know, newspaper editors will often give things headlines because it's clickbait and you're not in any control of it, which can really throw your idea into the fire and then you don't know what's going to happen. So that happened with me. I wrote a piece about, in reaction to a piece that was written saying that feminism has no use for science. And I was saying, actually, there's a lot in science that is useful to feminism. We need to engage with it, and this can be, this is a body of work that we need to engage with, because it has both done women a disservice, but also there's a lot of amazing, great new research being done, which is really useful. And they headlined it, "Feminists should end their mistrust of science," or something like that. And that "feminists should" doesn't go down well with people. So that was interesting, because I was still writing the book then, and it made me realize, okay, this, you have to talk about things carefully. You cannot assume that people know what you're talking about before a thing comes out before you say it. So yeah.
You don't have any readers from the right wing who sort of read your stuff beforehand, and or friends who
I
take
find
a
people
look
on
at
the far
things.
right don't even bother reading a lot of the time. They just read the headline.
Yeah.
Very often the trolls will not read very much. They will just read the headline or skim read stuff. Very rarely will they read a book. The book that you have written that they assume, or the book they assume that you've written. So I don't worry too much about that. But it can be interesting to have ideas out there. I mean, this race book that I'm writing now, because this is an issue that's so alive right now in science, I mean, it's moving so fast. Research is coming out, and like David Reicher's op-ed came out, that's the same research that I'm writing about right now. I'm interviewing him next week. So it's really weird to hear people responding to stuff that you haven't written yet, but that somebody else is talking about, and then think, okay, so this is what people are interested in hearing. These are the issues, the political issues around this. So that can be really useful sometimes.
So I am on this listserv of race scholars that was the genesis of this letter, and I should put you in touch with some of the people on that.
What is the name of the listserv? Because I may know it already.
I can't.
It's just whisper it to me later.
Yeah, I can't even remember it because I have my own nickname for it in my email.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
I'll as soon as I turn my phone on, I'll give it to you.
Thank you.
If we have time for one more question, if anybody wants. I don't know if that person is leaving or running to the microphone. Okay.
Hi. Okay, there we go. So you've talked a lot about how science has done a disservice to women, but since this is a gender and science talk, I was also hoping that you could talk about how science has done a disservice to transgender people.
Well, there's very little work on transgender. Surprisingly, there's hardly anything. I mean, Anne knows more about it. She's done some work.
Well, I'm wondering if you could come back and talk, maybe be a little bit more specific about the question, because as you say, there really is very, very little decent research on certainly transgender in a contemporary setting. The older work really is all from the medical literature, the medicalization of transgender, which was the only framework in which it was considered by scientists. So it's only now in the public eye in a way that's demanding that also in the scientific eye it be studied in some different way. If there's something more specifically you want to push me on, I'm happy to.
I guess I was wondering about, with the prior literature about the medicalization of being transgender, if that has, if people have gone back and reconsidered that, because now we're understanding gender more as not just your sex, but as a social construct, and so how people have modified their scientific understandings of being transgender.
I think that there's almost no sort of non-medical, in the scientific literature, there's almost no non-medical accounts of transgender. Yeah. And I think people, sex gender scientists like myself and like a few others who are beginning to think about this are only just beginning to try to write about what transgender is from a more theoretical point of view, outside of the medical context. Otherwise, the only way it has existed in the past has been through this process of medicalization. And even that process has changed enormously over the years, but it's still essentially been a medical take on it. And so I think what's happening now with transgender activism and with a diversification of transgender, there's a new book out called Trans Asterisk by somebody named Jack Halberstam. It's a great little book. It's the asterisk, the same way you do a neutral search on, if you want to search for a doc file, you do asterisk.doc. It's the same kind of thing. It's in its very presentation pointing to the idea that the old idea from the 50s of transsexual has just proliferated in ways so that into what's now transgender, which is many different things. The medical literature has only sort of one way of dealing with it, which is really to try and put it back in that old binary box. And the scientific literature of people who are actually interested in what I'm starting to call and other people are starting to call gender/sex, one word, gender sex, that literature is only beginning to find way to try to address how to study trans asterisk in ways that are not medicalized and that don't demand a kind of medical response necessarily. It's tricky because one of the goals of many of components of the transgender activist movement is to also get better medical treatment, which again puts it back into a medical world. But there is a really beginning interesting literature, and it's more in that interface of science studies, science anthropology about transgenders just beginning to emerge. Halberstam's book quotes I'm talking articles that have come out in 2017 and 2018. That's the articles I'm finding right now on this topic. So it's brand new.
This sounds like an excellent place to stop. We're talking about the future, where things are moving, and that's the next frontier, it sounds like. And Anne is right at the frontier, as is Angela. Thank you so much, both of you,
welcome.
for coming.
Great questions. Thank you.
And thank all of you, and thank all of you, and thank all of you, and thank all of you.